I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Julie Hulme, a fellow, a National Teaching Fellow at Keele University in the UK. And her talk is entitled Transitions and Belonging in Higher Education, Duck to Water or Fish Out of Water. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you so much, Martina, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see a good number of you here, and noting that some of us are on holiday and we've still come along, so thank you very much. So yes, I'm going to talk about transitions and belonging this morning, and I'm going to start by talking about two transitions projects that I've run and how my view of transition has changed over probably more than a decade of researching and working on student transitions. So I'm thinking about transitions in transition. How do we think about it and how do we change our conceptualization of transition maybe a little bit? I'm going to focus on what all this has to say about belonging. So how do we identify with our institution, with the other students at our institution? How do we feel like we fit in? What does that actually mean? I'm going to think about some practical strategies to create psychologically safe, so non-threatening, comfortable places for students to learn and belong, and how we ensure that that's inclusive. So I'm going to think about some issues around diversity and how different students might experience that. And I'm going to focus a little bit on some of my work with students as researchers with minoritised groups. And then I'm going to pause and open up for reflections and discussion. So hopefully you'll all have some fabulous ideas to share. I'm going to put the pressure back on you. And we can have a really good chat about how we help our students to feel that they belong at university, wherever they come from, and whatever type of university we're working in. So that's the plan for this morning. So I want to start by getting you to think back, and you can pop your ideas into the chat. And as I said just before we started recording, what we'll do is read those out without associating them with names for the sake of the recording, so you can stay anonymous. But have a think, how was your transition to university? What thoughts did you have? What emotions? What were your behaviours? So have a think about that and just pop your ideas into the chat. And while you do that, I'll tell you a little bit about my transition to university, because it's really where my career began and it's what informed everything that I've done subsequently, right the way through to the present time, getting my National Teaching Fellowship, all of that. Thinking about transitions has been absolutely central to everything that I've done, because I came to university, I did my undergrad at Keele and then I did my PhD at Keele. And I was thinking about, you know, what does it mean to go to university? I was a first in family student. I have Gypsy heritage, so I didn't grow up in the Gypsy community, but I do have a Gypsy background in some ways. And I didn't really know very much about university. It was where the clever kids went. It was where the posh kids went. I was a sort of working class student from Stoke-on-Trent. And I remember coming into uni on my first day being very, very nervous. Oh, I was also a single mom with a 4-month-old baby. And I'd taken some time out between finishing my A-levels and coming on to uni. So I remember coming onto campus and thinking, I don't know what to wear. What do university students wear? Hold on, they're all the posh kids, they'll be smart. So I put on a little blouse and a pencil skirt and court shoes and smartened myself up a little bit, almost like what I might wear for a job interview. I was told I'd got a seminar on my first day. Well, what on earth is one of those? So the social norms, the cultural norms of university were completely alien to me. The language was alien. I had no idea what to expect. And I can see some comments in the chat that are sort of reflecting some of that. So really feeling lonely, frightening, overwhelming, too much noise, anxiety-inducing homesickness, daunting, can't drink alcohol, feeling excluded because everybody else was drinking alcohol, turning up on campus with your parents, but you're not, so everybody else is getting help to move into. But it might be like school, which you hadn't enjoyed, younger than everyone else. But also some comments about being excited, really looking forward to it, a real sort of combination of emotion. Living off campus, I lived off campus too, and it did make it really difficult to engage with the social side. Coming in as an international student, as a foreign student in the UK, awful, horrible, neglected and disinterested. Coming from a lower working class family in a whole different country, the language, feeling lonely. But the university was good and the academic team was amazing. Everyone else knew what to do and where to go. Everybody else knew somebody else or how to get to know somebody else. Difficult to navigate everything. Could have been daunting, but swiftly meeting people and friends to stick with. Excited at all these amazing opportunities, so many people and ideas. Older students feeling like they both belonged and didn't, and it depended on the space they were in. Will I meet anyone who likes me? This word navigating again. Being told beforehand that you wouldn't be able to cope with the workload, and feeling like you're surrounded by smart students. That resonates quite a lot with me. But this idea as well that there might be safety in numbers, that many other people might be experiencing the same thing, thinking everybody else was more clever, sharing rooms with someone that you didn't know. I remember being absolutely terrified when I first applied to university. I didn't go because then I had my little one in between, but being told I might be sharing a room with someone and just thinking that's horrendous, no privacy, nowhere to escape to. So we've had this kind of real mix of excitement and thinking that everything's going to be all right and it's a new adventure, contrasted with this idea of overwhelm, anxiety, loneliness, isolation, not sure, uncertainty. And I think, that's still the case now. I mean, for some of us, for me certainly, it's quite a long time ago since I made the transition to university. Incidentally, the court shoes worked out very badly. Keele has a very slippy hill that's tarmacked, and it was raining. And so I kind of rushed down this hill to try and get to the next thing I had to do on my very first day, and slid and landed on my face, basically. So I didn't end up looking very smart for the rest of the day, and I soon learned that everybody else was much more comfortable in their jeans and their t-shirts and their kind of casual clothes. But it was a really scary day for me, because I just felt like, how am I going to fit in? Everybody's going to be younger, and everybody's going to be cleverer, and everybody's going to be richer. Finance was a real issue for me. So when we think about transitions, if we look at the literature and some of your comments, the idea of transition as a change, it's part of a journey. So we've quite a few of you talked about navigating, which ties in with that sort of journey metaphor, doesn't it? And we often think about, students leaving. If we think about the traditional 17, 18-year-old student going to university for the first time, it's a time when they're leaving a family. If they have a family, they might be care leavers, and we often make assumptions about the fact that they're leaving home for the first time. They may have been living on their own since 16. But we think about this, leaving your social support, leaving your friend network, your family, going into a university where class sizes are usually bigger, where the learning environment is very different, what's expected in terms of learning and teaching methods is very, very different. And there's a sort of shift in identity. So you're stopping being the teenager who lives with your parents and becoming a young adult. So the literature talks about emerging adulthood at this sort of stage, defining who you are and who you're going to be, thinking about where you fit in the world. What do you stand for? What are your values? Identifying as a student, what does that mean? So a lot of the work I've done is focused on this idea of social identity, of, you try and fit in with the group that you're part of. So if you identify as a student, what does that mean? Does that mean a hectic social life, lots of drinking, hangovers? Or does it mean the academic side of being a student? Or is there a bit of both? What do you expect of students, and how do you fit with that? So really working out who you are and how you fit with the people around you is very much a part of transition. And the literature does focus on some of that. And we've picked up on it again in the chat, where we've thought about, are we going to make friends? Are we going to meet people like us? Are we going to be different from everybody else? Some of that's about our expectations of what university will be like. So my colleague and collaborator, Naomi Winston, has talked a lot about the expectation versus reality gap. What do we expect university to be like? And that's what we're preparing for. And then when we get there, it's not quite the same. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we move forward. But Gale and Parker in 2014 discussed the idea that there are a lot of taken for granted notions of transition. So what we think transition is, we tend to make assumptions about it, and actually it may not be like that. So we need to challenge our own thinking about what transition is. And they say the normative and the universal discourses of transition do not capture the diversity of student lives, their experiences of university, or of universities themselves. And I think that's really important. So different students with different backgrounds have thought about university in different ways. Their expectations are different. The preparations that they've done may be different. Their expectations are different. Then when they get to university, their experience can be very diverse. So different students will experience the same university in different ways. But also, we often talk about preparing students for university. And I question what we're preparing them for, because a student who comes to Keele University will have a very different experience from a student who goes to Oxford University or who goes to Staffordshire University just down the road. Universities themselves are not the same. So how do we prepare students for a diversity of university, of higher education institutions? Indeed, it's not always a university. It could be that they're attending college-based higher education. So how do we take all of that into account? And it sounds like a bit of an impossible task, but it's not, I think. And hopefully, as we go through today, we'll see some of the things that I've been thinking about, that students have said in studies that we've done, about how we can think about this in different ways. So I first wrote about transitions in 2011. I wrote a paper with Helen Kitching, who's an A-level psychology teacher, and we talked about transitions in psychology. And the paper started with the title Bridging the Gap. So this sort of discourse within the transition is that there's a gap between where you were and where you're going to be, that there's some sort of big hole, big crevice that we've got to navigate our way across in order to successfully transition to university. And then I did some research while I was at the Higher Education Academy. So I used to be one of the discipline leads at the HEA before the restructure. And I did some work with Janet de Wilder, who was the director of the STEM team, the Science, Technology, Engineering and Maths team. And we ran a series of workshops. So this was based on the fact that I'd thought transitions were a big critical point for students, and there was this gap that they had to navigate. And so we arranged lots of workshops all over the UK, so England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And we brought together lots of different stakeholders in discipline-specific workshops. So we had lecturers in a particular subject and teachers who were teaching A-levels and BTECs and Scottish Highers and those sorts of subjects, those level 3 subjects, so pre-university qualifications, students from both sectors, both the universities and the schools and colleges, We also had people from exam boards for the pre-university qualifications, publishers, all sorts of people who had an interest in that particular subject. And we captured the discussions that our workshop participants had during these workshop discussions. And the things that we sort of heard in those discussions were very much around skills and knowledge gaps. So students don't come to university prepared for university. They don't know how to think like a psychologist, astronomer, geographer, engineer, etc. And pre-university qualifications were seen as a poor preparation. So particularly in England, the A-levels tend to rely on rote learning. And so students will learn sort of model answers and ways of answering particular questions. Critical evaluation is about learning 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses of a particular study and regurgitating them in an exam. And then when students get to university and we say, we need you to think critically, that's what they do because that's what they've been taught. And so lots of discussions around that lack of preparation from school and college. Although it was quite interesting because the A-level teachers and the international baccalaureate teachers and those sorts of people were saying, but they come to us unprepared. So in the UK, students at 16 take an exam, GCSEs in lots of different subjects. And they were saying they come to A-level unprepared from GCSE. And the GCSE teachers were saying, yeah, but they come to us unprepared. And so we coined this term that we were going to blame the midwife, that it just goes all the way back to, you know, the very first people who had anything to do with these students didn't teach them to think like a astronomer, psychologist, educationalist, whatever it might be. There was a lack of explicit signposting about what university would be. So students themselves were talking about really not knowing what to expect from university. We don't know what it's going to be. So that resonated very much with me. We don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to look like, what it's going to feel like, how to prepare. And we don't get information about how to prepare. So there's something about making the unknown known, giving them some clues about what to do to be ready for university. These days I say learn to cook and learn to do your own laundry, but you know, that's not what the teachers and the academics were interested in. Comments from university students about some of the things we were talking about in the chat, that anonymity of being in a large group. Someone mentioned 400 students in a group. How do I become a person in my own right in this mass, this sea of hundreds of other students when nobody knows my name? And I don't have the same teacher every week like I would do if I was at school or college. You know, my group of 30 with the same teacher every week becomes my group of 400 with a different teacher every week. How do I build relationships in that environment? How do I get to be known by my name? And then a tension between the sectors. So very much what I was saying about the different teaching styles, the ways in which education is delivered in schools and colleges compared to universities. And university lecturers being perceived as having a lot more resources than school and college teachers. So we have access to research, we have access to labs, we have access to colleagues who have specialist knowledge. We can read literature, we can find the latest paper on the thing that we're teaching about. Whereas in schools and college, often they don't have access to those things. And a lack of understanding on both sides, which definitely was evident in our data, that school teachers didn't really understand university teaching, and university teachers definitely did not understand what was happening in schools and colleges. But overall, there was a real feeling of a focus on deficits, a focus on the students don't know enough, the students aren't prepared, the students don't know stuff that they need to know. They're not equipped for this. There's something wrong and missing in the student. And deficit models always put my back up. So it's got me even more interested than I was when I started. Naomi Winston and I sat down. For those of you who don't know Naomi, she's a professor of higher education at the University of Surrey in the UK, and she's also a National Teaching Fellow. We sat down at a National Teaching Fellows Symposium, I think in Birmingham, a number of years ago. And we started to talk about this. It was something we were both interested in. We're both psychologists by training, and we were really kind of struggling a bit with the deficit focus of transitions. And so we started to talk about this over a glass of wine. And Naomi was familiar with this quote from Eccleston et al. That talked about transitions can lead to profound change and be an impetus for new learning, or they can be unsettling, difficult, and unproductive. Yet while certain transitions are unsettling and difficult for some people, risk, challenge, and even difficulty might also be important factors in successful transitions for others. And this reminded me of Mayer and Land's work on threshold concepts. So the idea that sometimes you have to navigate through a challenging space, a difficult space, in order to access knowledge and understanding and to be able to think in new ways about something. And that this is like standing on the threshold of a doorway, and the image in the top right-hand corner shows a big wide doorway. You're on the side of a darkened room, and there's just pure light on the outside. And this idea that to walk through that door is quite scary because you don't know how life's going to be on the other side. You have to go through this liminal, uncertain space. But in going through that, you are transformed. So the idea that transition might be challenging or exciting or both, but it is transformative. It is something that we all have to go through in order to come out the other side a better person, a more developed person, a better thinker, and more able to engage with our discipline of choice. So we started to think about this idea of maybe a transition as a rite of passage, but it didn't have to be difficult. It could be exciting. It was exciting. And I remember sitting in my bath trying to work out how neurons transmitted action potentials and think this is just impossible, and then having that eureka moment of now I understand neurons, and suddenly all the other things that I've been learning about start to make sense because I've grasped this threshold concept. So maybe transitions have something in common with that idea of going through something uncertain but coming out with a better understanding of who we are and what our subject means, and a more informed worldview. And so Naomi and I sort of started to develop this thinking and built it into a study which became a book chapter. So we thought that often we make assumptions about particular groups of students, and we started to question whether this was appropriate. So we might assume that low socioeconomic status students might have a more difficult transition than wealthier students, more affluent students. We thought about minoritized groups, ethnicity, non-binary gendered people, disabled students, first in family students, and the fact that the literature tends to focus on these big demographic groups and say this group is disadvantaged within higher education and this group is advantaged, and it's quite binary in its thinking. Who's going to find it hard? Who's going to find it easy? But we also thought about the fact that actually some students have knowledge about university. So if you have friends, family, siblings who went to university before you, you will have heard all their stories about university. So you'll have some knowledge about university, and you'll have formed expectations and a little bit of understanding from hearing those stories. No doubt people will have given you advice, although they won't have known, of course, which university you were going to, and they might not have been to that university themselves. So was that advice accurate? So those groups of students do have knowledge about university that perhaps first in family students have less knowledge about. However, knowledge of university, that lived experience of what it is like to be at university, is missing for everybody. And so we were sort of questioning the kind of, you know, how much use is that knowledge about? Sometimes it might be useful, sometimes it might be less useful. None of these students, even the most privileged student, comes with knowledge of university, unless they've already done a year and then changed course or something like that. And even then, it's not knowledge of the same course or the same university. So we were thinking that the big sort of demographic groups, the kind of looking at these kind of disadvantaged students, has some predictive value. You might predict that maybe a student who's first in family might find it harder than a student who has a long history of family engagement with higher education, but it's not a certainty. The fact that there could be a student who's heard lots about their family experiences of higher education, but still doesn't quite know how to fit themselves into that. Or there could be a student from a supposedly disadvantaged group who gets to university and realizes it really is for them. And despite their initial doubts, they fly when they get there. So we can't target students, and a lot of university interventions are focused on, well, we'll have a group of mature students and we'll get them all together and we'll form a little community for them, and that will help them with the transition. But we can't do that, because we don't know who's at risk. Everybody could be at risk, or everybody could be due to have a fantastic time. And when we talked to students about this, they talked about the fact that the problematization of transitions isn't always helpful. So by presenting this idea that transitions are challenging, they're difficult, they're hard, you're going to feel lonely, you're going to have times where you feel like you don't belong, the academic work's going to be harder, the assessment load's heavier. Independent study is one thing that pops up in a lot of my research, that, you know, you're not going to have structured time, you'll never cope with that. Framing it as this difficult, problematized experience isn't helpful, because students themselves say that actually transition can be really exciting. It can be really transformational. That's what happened to me. I got to university and I found out who I was and I had the best life. And so we need to capture student experience. We can't just make assumptions about people will struggle, certain people will struggle more than others, etc. So we asked students, and the title of this slide, "We're not all little fish in a big pond," is a quote from a student that we spoke to about this, who said, you know, I got to uni and I was great. You know, I was a big fish in a little pond. I felt like I was, you know, ruling the world. Everything was fab. And this is where the metaphor within this talk about ducks and fish first appeared. So a student saying, we're not all little fish in a big pond. And the idea of being a fish in water, being in your home environment, your comfortable, natural place. You take a fish out of water, it struggles to breathe, it drowns in the air, it flails about. But we could be fish in ponds, we could be happy little fish swimming about, having a great life. And so we conducted a quantitative survey with psychology first year students, where we had a combination of Likert scale responses, where students ranged from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and open questions, so they could give their own thoughts and their own experiences, and their own voices could be heard through the research. This is what we found. So this might be a little bit small, but if anybody wants me to send the slides, I'm quite happy to do so. I'll talk you through what we can see. So we took first year psychology students, 91 of them, and we asked them at time 1, which was when they first arrived at university, how confident they were about certain academic skills. And then we asked them again at time 2, which was the end of their first year. So they'd had a whole year in an undergraduate BSc psychology programme. And we compared their confidence ratings from the start with the end. And some of the skills did what you might expect. So students got more confident about their note-taking abilities as they went through the course of a year. So often in schools and colleges, students don't really have to take notes. They get lots of handouts, lots of materials online. They don't have to sit and write everything down. They were a bit worried that when they got to university and lecturers were racing on, like I'm doing now, covering lots of material really, really quickly, that they wouldn't be able to capture notes that were meaningful and useful to them when it got to the revision stage. So they got more confident, significantly more confident in that particular skill. They got more confident about their ability to write essays. They got very much more confident about their ability to use APA referencing style. So apparently this had worried them quite a lot at the beginning, and their confidence leapt up all the way through that first year. But some skills do different things. Some skills go down, they become less confident. A few stay the same. So that writing research reports was a bit worrying at the start and it was still a bit worrying at the end. But some things, they lose a lot of confidence. And one of those, the biggest change, is about keeping up with reading. They also lose confidence in their ability to attend. I'm trying to, there we go, maintain attendance. So that drops significantly from 4.5 to around 4 out of 5 through the year. So why are students getting less confident as the year goes by? And Naomi and I argue that this is because what they expected of university isn't what they found. So if we think about keeping up with reading and we think about attendance, those are very much self-regulatory skills that students are having to do for themselves. And they're not used to that. So all of their experiences of education, right the way through to the sort of 16 to 18-year-olds, is that somebody tells them what to do. 91, Maria. Somebody tells them what to do and they do it. And they have a certain amount of time to do it. And they have timetabled time to do some of these things. And attendance is monitored for every single class, and their parents are often there, if they've grown up with parents, to send them out the door to school in the morning. Whereas they've got to university, maybe they've gone out for a night at the SU with their mates just before a 9 o'clock lecture, and suddenly 100% attendance doesn't seem quite so easy. The reading one particularly fascinates me because I had a PhD student a few years ago who did some work with, he followed students longitudinally through from sixth form through to university, and he ran a series of focus groups with sixth formers, so 16 to 19-year-olds. And he said, what are you expecting to be different at university? And one of the things that nearly all of the students discussed was this idea of independent study. I'm going to have to study independently. And he said, well, you know, how can you prepare for that? Are you prepared for that? And they said, yeah, absolutely. My teachers talked to me all about what independent study is and how I'm going to have to do it. And I'm absolutely prepared for it. I'm a really keen, motivated student. It's all going to be good. Then they got to university and he followed up with an email. What surprised you about university? What weren't you prepared for? And the answer came back very loud and clear from lots of students: independent study. And he said, but you said you were ready for that. You understood it. You knew what to expect and you thought you could cope with it. What changed? And the answers from the students were things like, you know, when I was at school, when I was at college, my teacher would say, read chapter 2 of our textbook. Read pages 37 to 41. We knew exactly what to do. And at university, the lecturers say, go do some reading. Well, what do I read? Oh, anything. Just do a literature search, find something for yourself. But if you've been taught that everything has a right answer, which often happens in school and college teaching, And I'm not blaming school and college teachers for this, by the way, because they have to teach very much to a curriculum to get their students through their exams, because otherwise they're doing their students a disservice. And they don't have enough time in the curriculum to do extra around it very often. But this idea of independent reading and keeping up with it, oh my goodness, it suddenly becomes so much more complicated. And one of the big things around independent study is this lack of structure. And I think that's what students really don't expect or don't know to expect, or even if they have knowledge about independent study, the knowledge of themselves and knowing whether they can do that and they can self-regulate and self-manage and cope with that lack of structure when they could put everything off till next week and nobody will notice, and then they can get behind, is much more challenging than we think it is. So as I say, we really sort of pulled out of this the idea that students just don't know to expect that, and they're not prepared for it, and that they don't know how they cope with it because they've never had to. And as it says in the chat, it is always much more vague and much bigger in higher education than it is in secondary education. But how do we scaffold students into that? So I'm not thinking about this in terms of students not being prepared and continuing that thinking about a deficit model. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of anxiety over whether I'm doing enough. Am I directing my attention towards the right stuff? Because I haven't got that scaffolding and that guidance. So I'm not thinking about this as a fault in students. This is something that almost universally students say. And if you have a chat with your own first years, I'm pretty sure you'll hear something very, very similar. How do we get them over that? How do we say, well, okay, at school, you had to read pages 41 to 56 of a textbook. Now it's different. How do we teach them to cope with that need for self-regulation and to know how to attack and take on that challenge? So we have to equip them at university. I don't think they can be equipped beforehand, but still sort of coming back to that expectation and reality, not knowing what it is. My slides are frozen. That's not good. Oh, there we go. Now they haven't. So the follow-up to this was that we talked to students about their experiences of transition previously to see if there was anything that we could learn from that. And so again, these were English students, so they'd done GCSEs at 16 and then went into A-levels at school or college. And we asked them, how was your experience of transition to A-level? And in what ways was it similar to when you made the transition into GCSE? So from your sort of 12 or 13-year-old self into the GCSE years, what was that like then going into A-level? And what did you learn from that earlier transition from GCSE to A-level that's helped you with the transitions to university? Students hadn't really thought about these questions before, and they found it quite an interesting experience, I think. And they talked about the similarities. So they said we had to be more independent. And yes, it was different independence, but we still had to be more independent. We got less structure. Oh yeah, now we've got to do that again and be even more independent. They talked about an increased workload. They talked about academic work getting harder. But they also noted that there was a difference, that when they go to university, they often go on their own. They don't go with a whole cohort of students from the same school and keep the same friendship groups. Some students, if they went to sixth form in their own school, had the same teachers, and that doesn't happen. So much more on their own, not as supported socially by their peers and their teachers. And when they thought about this, they said, actually, I've got some skills. I have got some skills. I've learned to become more independent. I've learned to do more reading. I've learned some stuff about being a student from this that I can apply again. And also recognizing that, yes, transition can sometimes be difficult, but oh, I've survived other transitions. I'll survive this one too. So just giving them a little bit of confidence to learn their own lessons again. And I often think about this. I'm about to transition into a new job. And I'm thinking, what did I learn last time I transitioned into a new job? What's going to be similar? What do I expect about this? What conversations can I have before I get there to make sure that I'm well informed and that, you know, I hit the ground running when I get there? So thinking about it all the way through our academic careers can actually be a useful way to think. What can we learn from our previous transitions? And so Naomi and I concluded that actually reflecting on historical personal transitions can be much more helpful than asking the university to set a whole kind of host of homogeneous resources about this is what you can expect if you study here at the University of Poppleton. Yeah, this is what Poppleton expects of you. Can actually not particularly help that diversity of students. But also allowing students to share stories with each other, giving them an opportunity to talk to each other, perhaps through mentoring, perhaps through narrative testimonials, and offering those opportunities in the curriculum. And if you have a look at the Education for Mental Health toolkit that's been produced by Advance HE, you know, putting that in curriculum is really important so all students can access it, because anything that's extracurricular can exclude students like me who have to rush home to the baby. We can't hang around and spend more time on the uni campus. And that gives opportunities for making social connections and joining up students to form those friendships. So we thought there was a lot that we could be doing in terms of more longitudinal research, working with students as collaborators, as partners in this, to develop resources, to get students telling stories, mentoring and researching the transitions issue. In collaboration across sectors so that university students can, and they were really keen, can talk to school and college students about their knowledge of. So they won't get knowledge of for themselves, the school students, but they will get some insights from university students. But also thinking about this idea of transitions through education as a continuing process. We don't just go to university as our first transition. We go from home to nursery, nursery to primary school to secondary school. You know, there's lots of transitions, from postdoc to first lectureship, from, in my case, reader to professor on my next transition. All changes that we learn from. And so thinking really, and this is where we come back to sort of my idea, so this idea of developing a social experience and a sense of belonging within universities. So the idea that anybody could be a duck to water, you think of that little baby duckling jumping into the pond, never seen a pond before, but it can swim as soon as it gets there and it's really happy swimming around and splashing, or the fish out of water that isn't coping. So we need to build this social support that students were saying was missing in that transition from A-level to university. We need to find ways to put that back, to support students socially, to make connections and belong. And that also was a theme from this paper, which I'm not going to dwell on, but we each wrote a series of short reflections on some transitions research. And the key finding from that paper, when we pulled together 4 different transitions studies, was that actually academic kindness, this idea of social support as a buffer that supports us. So even if we are a fish out of water, there's someone there to help put us back in the water. That there's somebody, if we're a duck to water, there's somebody to swim with and play with on the pond if we're a duck. You know, that social support is absolutely essential for all transitions. And for me, this sort of resonates with the psychological theory, Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model, the idea that the individual is always situated within a social context. The individual brings things to that social context, and that social context puts things back onto the individual. So we have to think about both the environment and the individual if we're thinking about development, which is what transition is. It's a part of our adult development. So students differ in lots of different ways, and some of you will be familiar from this HEA work from Liz Thomas and Helen May back in 2010. And they talk about diversity in a much broader way, and I really like this. They talk about educational, dispositional, circumstantial and cultural elements of diversity. And so they talk about the fact that actually your experience at school, if you went to a Chinese school or you went to an English school, those are not the same experience. They're really not. How does that prepare you for university? What effect does that have on you while you're taking part in higher education? What about your confidence, your level of maturity, your marital status? If you live in a rural location, do you have access to IT in the same way as you do if you live in the middle of a big city? Your language, your social background, all of these things are part of who you are. And we all vary on all of these dimensions, and they don't claim that that's a comprehensive list. So how do all of those diverse people with all of those diverse characteristics then belong? And I like this illustration from Meehan and Howells that talks about belonging as how I fit in right now, being, who am I? And who am I in comparison to all these other people around me? And these are the things we talked about right at the beginning when we were reflecting on our own transitions, but also becoming, who will I be? And thinking about that in terms of, you know, I'm a first year psychology student, I want to be a psychologist, that's who I'm going to be, but also in terms of personal values, I want to be a kind person, I want to earn lots of money, I want to be a humanitarian, you know, how does all that fit together in who I'm becoming? And that we have to think about that whole picture if we really want to think about how students feel that they belong. All of these are hyperlinked, so if we send you the slides, you can follow the links to the articles. And I really love this idea from Christine Hawkins. Inclusive learning is the ways in which pedagogy, curricula and assessment are designed and delivered to engage students in learning that's meaningful, relevant and accessible to all. It embraces a view of the individual and individual difference as the source of diversity that can enrich the lives and learning of others. And to me, that last bit is absolutely crucial. We don't see diversity as a problem. We don't think about the deficits in a big demographic group. Instead, we think, what can that student from a different cultural background bring into the classroom that everyone can learn from? We can't represent all those diverse perspectives, but students can represent their own perspective and we can all learn from it. And by building in these kind of active learning, peer learning, interactive parts to our classes, we allow students to learn from each other. We allow them to be actively engaged in reshaping their knowledge, and we motivate them. We allow them to find meaning in the learning that they're doing. And all of that, we know from psychology, underpins effective learning. And so I'm arguing that actually we put some of this into our teaching methods to ensure that students' voices are heard. So I use all sorts of different ways of doing this. I scaffold things, I introduce things in a gentle way. So I might start by saying, read this paper, this particular paper, and then say, find another paper that contradicts it. And I give them some ways through it. Using things like flipped learning, problem-based learning, lots of group work and discussion. I get my students to generate class reading lists. So if they find something that they found interesting, I get them to share it. And then other students can look at the same paper, and that helps to bring in those different perspectives. Giving students ownership, responsibility for their own learning. They bring that decolonizing approach that I'm not going to dwell on here, but allowing us to think about research from different cultures, in different languages even, giving students choice, authentic assessment, see Sally Brown and Kay Samble always, and thinking about university design for learning, so building curricula that are designed to be inclusive from the start. Making sure that we hear lots of diverse student voices. We tend to talk about student voice here in the UK, and I think it's a big mistake because there isn't one student voice. So building learning communities and building teaching that allows those learning communities to build. And this is something that I've done with my student researchers. So I work with students at undergraduate and master's level and PhD to do research. And here you can see 4 of those students. There's been 18 of them this year. So I've just picked 4 that have got something that will either be published or has been published. I'm going to focus on Pippa Hamilton for a minute. She's an MSc student and she has ME, so chronic fatigue syndrome. And she wanted to research for her final year project the experiences of higher education for students with chronic illnesses. So she is a member of that community. She got to research her own community to be the person who could amplify the voices of the community of students with chronic illness. She has the most amazing social network. So she was able to kind of bring in lots of different students to participate. She got really rich data. We published that as a paper, and she then did a similar project, but a different methodology for her MSc, and we're going to publish that as well. But she's, she started out being told that you'll never go to university, your attendance is too poor. She came out with a first, and then she came out with a distinction in a master's. But what we did was set up team spaces where the students could talk to each other. I was learning from my students were learning from each other. It was a proper learning community where those conversations got really sophisticated in their thinking, and students were stretching each other. And I was sitting back and going, oh my goodness, I've never thought of it like that. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And I do this now as much as I possibly can. But the idea is that these students are then informing policy and practice. So Stacey Lyons there is a visually impaired PhD student. She's published the Wonky, and that started, we got lots of contact from universities. How can we be more inclusive for our disabled students? Emma Crabb is autistic and looked at particularly how autistic women can camouflage and mask their autism. And Cleo looked at students with specific learning difficulties during the pandemic. So they're working on different topics, but they've all got things in common, and they were supporting each other. So we really need to think about how do we deal with these diverse students and the complexity. And de Klerk et al. Talk about that kind of, the fact that every individual has to adapt in their own way to this new environment. So stepping away from labels. And one of the things I think can really help is to use this term intellectual streaking from Behrman and Malloy. And you might find the term offensive, but the idea isn't shocking. It's that we're authentic in our classrooms. We talk to students about the things we struggled with. We talk to students about how we had to go through this process of learning and where it was difficult and what helped us. And students can identify the person who is like them and can see somebody else who had a similar journey, but also giving students their opportunities to share perspectives and to support each other. And I think that's a really important part of university. So I'm just going to pop up that last slide. I'm sorry, Marina, I really did push the timing, with the Hawkins quote again, and perhaps some stimulation for discussion. But I'm very happy to answer any questions or discuss anything really. So thank you for your attention and patience.